Hello, so let's check out a finished project before we start over with a new one. This graphic comes from an After Effects project that's online by the designer Aliyar Mikayilov, and if you want to go and check out the link that I put in the description, you can see this graphic roll in at about the 1 minute mark. So we have this line flourish that animates in, and that produces this rising line that will reveal the main titles, and they'll drop down to be revealed, and then we have this subtitle running along the top, and the subtitle makes use of that dual textured typography with the stencil running in unison with the clean typography. There's three distinct applications of masking to bring all the effects together. And in the layers panel, not too much going on to build this graphic. We've got three groups, and each group is self-explanatory. We've got the titles group, the lines group, and this high title group. And to animate everything out, we have this clone layer, which is set to reverse. Okay, so that's that. Let's get into the project. Okay, so the project is 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames a second, and it's set for 11 seconds duration, but we're only going to need 10 seconds. To begin, I just have this background group, and sitting in there is a gradient generator with a purple to dark blue gradient running diagonally, just trying to keep a similar color profile to the After Effects graphic that I'm trying to reproduce. So the first thing we want to do is add those lines. So I'm just going to add a new group, rename it lines, and with my line tool selected, I'll draw a line in. In the inspector and geometry, we want this at -265 and 265 to set the length there, and I'll come into properties and set the X position at 0 to center it, and the Y position at -150, and come back into shape, into styles, and give it a width of 10 and a color. I'm going to give it this blue color. Alright, so now to animate, we'll come into the first point offset with the playhead at the start and set a keyframe for the first point and the last point offset, and set them both to 50%. And then with the playhead at 1 second 5 frames, bring the first point offset back to 0 and the last point offset to 100%, and I'll just rename this line as leader. Okay, so I'm going to grab these curves here and right click and set the interpolation to a Bezier, and we have this ease in and ease out effect now, but I want to reduce that for each curve. Like this, just in keeping with the After Effects graphic. Okay, so now I want to duplicate this, and I'm going to rename it as mask, because we're going to mask out that first line. So with the playhead at 5 frames, make sure that second line is selected, and on the keyboard hit the shift and left bracket key to move the endpoint of that element to the 5th frame. And I'll just bring the playhead to 1 second and 8 frames, and I'll grab that last point and bring it back so the masking line animates slightly faster than the leader line. Okay, so select that leader line, right click, add image mask, drop our masking line in there and set the blend mode to subtract, and come into the inspector with the mask line selected and increase the width to 14. Okay, so now we want the third line that comes in that will rise up to reveal the title. So I'm going to duplicate that leader line and command right bracket to move it above the mask line. I'll get rid of the image mask. I'm going to rename this as the riser or rising line. And we want this endpoint to be on the 10th frame. So I'll shift my playhead to 10 frames and shift left bracket to move the endpoint. And then we want this line to animate in faster than the other two as well. So I'm just going to bring my playhead to 2 seconds and 10 frames. Sorry, 1 second and 10 frames. And pull that last keyframe point back. So now we have the initial flourish effect with the lines animating in. If you do go and check out the link to the source graphic, I think you'll see it's similar to how that graphic begins. It's not exactly the same, but it's close to the general look and feel. Now we want this riser line to begin ascending at the 1 second mark, so I'll make sure it's selected. I'll come into the properties, and for the Y position value I'm going to set a keyframe, and the animation runs 1 second and 10 frames, so I'm going to bring the playhead to 2 seconds and 10 frames and set the Y position value to 61. Now in the keyframe editor I'm going to turn off the offsets so I can just pay attention to this Y position curve here. So we want a very slow crawl in the beginning, and then it will jump up before settling. So I'm going to grab this handle and bring it across about here, and this handle over this way. That'll do for now. So we have our lines group finished, and we can get busy with the title effects now. So I'm going to add a new group, call that titles, and I'll grab the text tool and enter in the main title. Okay, so the font that I'm using here is Unisans Heavy, and it's available to download free online, and I'll put a link to that in the description. We want the font size to be 78, and I'll center the alignment, and I want the X value at 0. Now the endpoint for this title is 2 seconds, so I'm going to bring my playhead to 2 seconds and use I on the keyboard to trim the element there. And I want to keyframe this to drop down over 1 second and 15 frames. So at the 2 second point, I'm going to set the Y position to 56, and then with the play and all set a keyframe there, and with the playhead at 3 seconds and 15, I'm going to set the Y position to -29, and I'll adjust this curve so the text will rush down and then settle into place. Okay then, so now we can add the second line of the title. So I'll grab the text tool, make sure titles group selected, grab the text tool, and what do I have? Just motion graphic, and the font size we want here is 48 is fine. The tracking we want at 23%. And I'm going to drop this to regular. Center the alignment, reset the, well, I just want the X position to 0. The endpoint for this is 1 second 20 frames. So I'll bring my playhead there and use I on the keyboard to trim the text element there, and move forward just 1 frame and set the Y position value to 6.7 and set a keyframe, and bring the playhead to 3 seconds and set the Y position value to -89.5. And I'll do the same with this curve as I did the main title. So our title elements are in place, and the next thing we want to do is add the masking element for these titles. So I'm going to grab the rectangle tool. Just make sure the titles group is selected. I'm going to grab the rectangle tool and draw out a shape that's wider than the title elements and taller than them. Just rename this shape as our title mask. And with the shape selected, I'm going to come to behaviors and give it the align to behavior. Okay, so behaviors, basic motion, align to. And I'm going to use the riser line as the source, and we'll set this setting here, or this to riser setting, as bottom, and this one as bottom. Okay, so now grab the titles group, right click, select add image mask, and drag that title mask in as the source, and set the blend mode to subtract. Okay, so the next step is to add the subtitle that runs along the top. So I'm going to add a new group, and I'll call this group the high title. And I'll start this by grabbing the original leader shape, and I'll duplicate that, delete the image mask, and to rename it as lead, and drag that up into the high title group. Now I'm going to add two more groups to this high title group. I'm going to name the first group lead, the second group follow, and drag them both in there. And I'll drag that lead line into the lead group, and I'm going to reset the first and last point offset. Just set the color to white, and I want the Y value, Y position at 98, and I'm going to set the width to 100. And turn off the start and end caps. Okay, so I'm just checking my notes off screen here. So this element here, we want it to begin at the 2 second and 20 frame mark. So I'll bring my playhead to 2 seconds 20 frames and hit I on the keyboard to trim it. This high title group, I'm going to move under the lines group, and I'll grab the lead shape element there and lift the Y position so it sits right on the line. So Y position at 112 there. So now I want to animate this line, and I'm going to do that by animating the offsets again. So I'll come into the shape, and with the playhead at 2 seconds 20 frames, I'm going to set a keyframe for the last point offset and pull that back to 0. And then with the playhead at 4 seconds and 5 frames, I'll bring that last point offset to 100%. And I'm going to come into the keyframe editor and grab that curve, set the interpolation to Bezier and break the tangents on the handles. So we're going to give this very hard ease in and ease out. Drag that handle that way and drag that handle this way. So we have a slow, stretched, slow animation, hopefully here. Okay. Now I'm going to animate the first point offset. So I'm going to copy this curve here. So I've selected the curve, I'm going to right click and copy. Now I'm going to move my playhead to, just checking my notes, three seconds. So 10 frames later, the first point offset is going to animate in. So my playhead's at 3 seconds, so I'm going to come to the inspector and select the first point offset, and I'm going to right click and choose Show in Keyframe Editor. In the keyframe editor I'm going to select it, set a keyframe, and Command V to paste that curve on it. And I'll just grab this group and set it back to animated so we can see both curves there. So now we have this line element animating across. So now we can add in the actual title element itself. So in the lead group inside the high title group, I have the lead group selected. I'm going to select the text tool and enter in the text, top title, and the font size I want as 48. And I'm going to set that to heavy, center the alignment, set the X position to 0, and the Y position to 98. And we want to keyframe this. So the in point is 3 seconds and 15 frames. So I'm going to bring my playhead to 3 seconds and 15 frames and set the X position to 200. And now bring and set that keyframe there. And now I'll bring my playhead to 5 seconds and set the X position to 0. And this curve I'm going to animate so it rushes in and then settles. Maybe even a bit faster, I think, if I remember the After Effects source graphic correctly. Okay, so as you can see in this high title group, we've got these two groups, lead and follow, and if you've seen my previous walkthroughs, I think you'll recognize this is how I start to build that double texture with titles. So we get the stenciled effect followed by the clean typography. So what we're going to do is grab this lead shape, right click it and add image mask, and use our title as the source and set to subtract. So now we have the stenciled part of the element, but what we need to do is have the clean typography run in unison with it. So we start that process by duplicating the top title, so Command D, and I'm going to drag that copy into that follow group that we had earlier, and I'm going to turn it on. Then I'm going to grab this lead shape and duplicate it, and I'll drag that also into the follow group. I'm going to rename it as follow and delete the image mask. Now this follow group, I'm going to reset the first point offset and the last point offset. And just so we can see what's happening here, I'm going to just change the color to anything else. So I want the last point offset to match the first point offset of the lead line. So to do that, I'm going to use the link behavior. So I'll come into the last point offset, drop down the menu and choose add parameter behavior link, and I'm going to choose the lead line as the source for that link, and in the compatible parameters I'm going to come to object, shape, outline, first point offset. So now you can see that the follow line's last point offset matches the lead line's first point offset, and where they meet we get half and half. This is where we can have half clean typography and half stenciled typography, and we're going to get that effect by coming to this follow group, right click it, add image mask, and drop in the follow line as the source, and then the effect is completed. So let's have a look at where we're at. Okay, so what am I missing here? I want to grab that top title line copy and bring my playhead to 3 seconds and 15, and hit I on the keyboard to trim it. So now we have our graphic animating in. And the last thing we want to do is animate everything out. So bring the playhead to 5 seconds and select each group and hit O on the keyboard just to trim every element to the 5-second mark. And now I'm going to add a new group, and I'll just call this group Animate In, and I'll shift select our previous titles, lines and high title group and drag it in there. And with the Animate In group selected, I'm going to right click and choose Make a Clone Layer, and with the clone layer selected I'm going to use the shift left bracket shortcut to shift the endpoint. So now our clone layer begins exactly where our animating graphic finishes, and with the clone layer selected I'll come into properties, and here in the timing section, if you can't see it, just click here show, and I'm going to set it to reverse. Finally, I'm going to turn on motion blur and run preview. And I'll mark the play range out at 10 seconds. Now let's have a look. So there we have another After Effects typographic reconstruction. If you get over and have a look at the source graphic, I think this time I just got in the ballpark for the general look and feel. I definitely learned something interesting in how to mask out and animate these line flourishes to begin the graphic, which is actually just the same method that I used in the After Effects reproduction, the 6th one that I posted, I think, just applied on a smaller scale for a different reason. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope that there was something in this that will help you for your future projects.